Today's economy is relying to a great extent on these platform ecosystems. Companies that create platforms that are based on certain technologies. These are the information technology or infrastructure that we all rely on. And the hope in the early 2000s was that these technology companies will relieve us from the burden of big corporations by providing us with information advantage when we go to transact, work with companies that don't need travel agents anymore. But the outcome was just the opposite. The Davids didn't beat the Goliaths, the Davids became the Goliaths. And this is very clear in the reports of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust and also the European Union committees. They all pointed to the fact that these technology companies have become the new monopolies that control our economy and society. So how this happened? Well, these companies were very good in differentiating the products, offering attractive services to customers, luring them, and then leveraging the network externalities of the internet to gain scale fast and gain dominance. It's very difficult to undo their position given the winner-take-all structure of the internet. And they managed to drive out established competitors as well as new emerging competitors. And probably you say, okay, what about antitrust? The issue is that antitrust is not well equipped to deal with this because the traditional antitrust law wants to deal with this by making sure that consumers do not pay too much high prices and there is no restriction on output. This is how traditionally we think about the role of antitrust, but in the digital economy, this is not the case. You get services for free, there is no restriction on output, but still there is constraint on competition. So the laws are not equipped to deal with this emerging phenomenon, and traditional measures of dominance and control are not relevant anymore. And these companies are using a new kind of currency, data, private data, in order to gain an advantage. The result is that these companies are able to drive out competition, and they do this with questionable practices like self-preference, preferring their own products. If you think about Google, Apple, Amazon, so they will use their control, to promote their own products and services at the expense of others. They will use defaults to make it more difficult for consumers to switch to alternative services. About 90% of the users of Android or iPhone keep using the same platforms. They are not switching even though they have a choice. And also they are acquiring innovative contenders. So think about Facebook acquiring Instagram, Google acquiring Waze. So if there is a company that shows some potential, they are likely to be acquired by these companies. You might think that the complementors, those partners, vendors that work on the platform will share the gains with these platform owners, but this is not the case. So just to mention the Apple versus Epic games, these companies are raising their fees, they are restricting the business of their complementors and vendors, and they offer sometimes free substitutes. So these companies, the big tech companies, are leveraging their market power and charging high fees, not only from users, but also from these vendors. In a way, they are serving as gatekeepers that divide users, consumers, from the vendors that provide the services. And they also restrict the value that is being shared with those vendors. What about consumers? You might think, okay, so they are benefiting from the access to great variety of products, greater availability, personalized services, presumably cheaper prices. And this is how initially these companies are luring these consumers. But when you think about this further, you realize that these companies are increasing their switching costs, making it very difficult for consumers to leave the service. They are self-preferencing their own apps, so they're restricting options to consumers. If they are acquiring other companies, this also limits options to consumers. And eventually they increase their fees once they capture a dominant position. And also by limiting options through acquisitions, they cause increase to prices. Now the impact of consumers is not only economic, it also relates to their welfare. And we all know about these cases like Facebook and Instagram causing social harm and personal harm to users. And the issue is that they will always prefer the profit interests on the welfare of society. What about employees? Well, some employees are definitely benefiting from this, especially the owners of these platforms, which are the richest people on the planet. And maybe some programmers with big skills are also being well compensated. But how come that none of the big tech companies is on the list of the top 10 companies, favorite companies to work for? Apparently, these employees, many of them are unfortunate. Many of the employees are temporary employees, do not have the expected social benefits. Think about Amazon, 1.3 million workers. Not all of them are programmers. Some of them are in the warehouse, working very hard and being treated like robots or machines. So there is a lot of mistreatment, surveillance, Taylorism, cult-like culture in these companies that restricts the voice of employees. And even if you are a top programmer and you are raising a complaint about an algorithm, you are likely to find your way out of this company, like some of the notorious cases that we know. It's not just these big tech companies. In fact, if you walk outside of the big tech, your situation on average is much worse because the trend over the past decades has been for companies to provide less benefits to employees, to shift to more freelance work, and there are many kind of ghost workers that are paid by the hour and must work much harder for less. So think about Uber drivers or other kind of delivery employees that are relying on these platforms for their business, and they are subject to very discretionary decisions. So what has been the solution? The main approach has been policy making, regulation, antitrust, and other approaches to try to cope with this. But as I mentioned, the current regulation is insufficient because of the unique nature of these digital technologies, and this is why the effort has been to come up with new regulation and to revise some of the laws and bring some of these cases to the court. But also the court system is very slow, it's biased against the plaintiffs. It's very difficult to use these laws to achieve these objectives, and the adjustments of this law is much slower than the time it takes for these companies to change their business model or features. They can do that in seconds, but for the regulation it takes years, if not a decade. So there was the House Judiciary Committee report that investigated the big tech. You probably followed this in the news in the past couple of years. And they came up with very extreme recommendations, like breaking up the big tech companies, preventing some of these policies and practices. But these are just recommendations, and only now we start to see some of the practical implications. But the issue is that these suggestions are not going to achieve the end result. Let me explain why. First of all, if you want to undo mergers, or you want to prevent acquisitions, then this is not necessarily beneficial to society. It can be a very inefficient solution if you take an integrated solution and disintegrated it. And it's very challenging for antitrust laws because they are not violating the existing laws in obvious ways. Now, removing the anti-competitive defaults, this is again problematic because it's misaligned with the antitrust regulation and is actually not that beneficial, and very easily can be bypassed by these companies. Asking them to share commercial data with competitors is first of all contradicting privacy laws and proprietary IP laws, etc. So it's problematic on the legal side, but also it discourages innovation. Probably will harm mostly the small emerging startup companies, not the big tech. And finally, trying to restructure this platform, share ownership, doesn't prevent collusion. And we've seen that this doesn't work in the past. If you think about AT&T and other kind of approaches. What needs to be done is to revisit and adjust the antitrust laws. but it's not obvious how to do that effectively. I know that some of my colleagues are involved in different efforts to revise legislation, regulation, but I talked with the former European Commission for antitrust, and he admitted to me that it's insufficient. It's not going to work because it's slow, ineffective, and big tech companies are always a step ahead, if not more. So the approach of the Judiciary Committee in the United States, as I mentioned, is unlikely to succeed. What we see in Europe is a different approach. In Europe, the approach was, okay, let's accept your position, recognize these big tech companies are now in control, and just ask them to be nice. So they introduced the legislation that's supposed to promote self-regulation and explain when a company becomes a gatekeeper and what it does, then what needs to be done. But this new emerging legislation is full of loopholes. For instance, it focuses on digital platforms, but many of these companies are operating outside of the digital space. Also, because of this self-regulation, it implies that these companies are not subject to external public scrutiny, which is not the case. And eventually, it's just a collection of words. It doesn't have substance to it if you go into depth looking at this regulation. And most importantly, this regulation harms, again, mostly the small companies that cannot really meet the requirements and are subject to much more scrutiny. These big tech companies have enough lawyers and experts to learn how to maneuver in this space.